been in the renewable energy market now for about 13 years. So, I've seen the huge amount of growth and acceleration that's happened, particularly when it comes to things like solar and wind energy. But as the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change showed just this week, we still have a long way to go if we're to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So with that in mind, we're going to be hearing from two stalwarts of the energy industry about what individuals, corporations, and governments can do about the energy transition. And we're going to be using a mixture of presentations and discussion and Q&A. And we're going to have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So please do get all your questions ready. And Katie's going to be monitoring the online audience as well. So with that in mind, I'd first like to ask both panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their personal motivations and their journey for how they got here. Maybe Julian, you go first.
Julian Critchlow. I'm an advisory partner with Bain. I joined Bain many years ago, 35 years ago. For most of my career, I spent it in the energy and utility sector. And the last 11, I ran Bain's global utilities and renewables sector. About 5 years ago, I stepped back from that, retired from Bain. I got headhunted to go into the civil service, an unusual career move. Very exciting time to go in the middle of Brexit. Little did I know that I was going to have a general election and COVID to come. I was in the civil service responsible for all of the UK's climate action, domestically and internationally. So that's everything from legislating for net zero and all the plans to deliver that, through to the international climate finance and the bid for and the preparation for COP26, which we obviously held in Glasgow. I retired just before COP26 to return back to business and came back as an advisory partner to Bain and working with various other businesses who are helping the energy transition.
Great, thank you very much, Julian. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Tom DeLay. I'm Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust, which I've been for over 20 years. I started my career as an engineer. I joined Shell, went overseas because I happened to be French, so I went to French-speaking Africa and spent almost 10 years of the 16 years I spent in Francophone Africa. I went to INSEAD as part of my time with Shell, and then went back to Shell and did various other roles again. And I suppose it was a very early experience I had working in Djibouti next to Ethiopia during Live Aid that suddenly made me aware that actually there's profit in this purpose. And I've always been very attracted to the purpose as well as the profit, and actually the opportunity to work in a sector where you can bring professional skills to something that really matters is something that appealed to me then, way back, and appealed to me when the Carbon Trust opportunity came up. So I left Shell, I spent at McKinsey, and I was sort of looking for something else to do, and purpose came along, and Carbon Trust has been that ever since. So we're a kind of non-profit advisory, non-advocacy group, about 430 of us scattered around the world. We work with governments, we work with corporates, with financial institutions, and for the last 2 or 3 years, everything we've done has been net zero, helping people be more ambitious, finding ways to square the circles around net zero. It really has become our focus in every part of the world across multiple sectors. That's us.
Great, thank you very much. So Julian, can I maybe invite you to talk to us a little bit about the implications for the UK and the world on the net zero transition?
Right, thank you. What I thought I'd do is just run through some very quick slides covering basically 2 parts of my career, which were from an energy sector point of view and from a carbon transition. What does it actually mean for a country like the UK, as an example, to deliver that energy transition? And then to look at it on from the other side, which is the investor side, just what kind of opportunities does this create, or as the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, put it, it was the kind of green industrial revolution. So, there we go. So the first topic I was going to cover was just the nature of the transition, which is very complex, and just wanted to bring that a bit alive as to what that actually means. So from the starting point, if you look at the overall set of carbon emissions that you have to get rid of in the global economy, you can see it covers as you might expect, all of the different parts of the economy. So it covers the industry, it covers buildings, it covers transport. Obviously, it covers energy, which was my primary sector that I was used to, but it also covers agriculture. And, you know, whilst the mix will vary by country, you know, this is a general picture across the economy. So everything has to change if you want to go to zero. When you look at that from a UK perspective, or from most of the developed markets, you see that we have a lot of businesses which are built off the previous legacy set of energy. So we, as a stock market, are about the third most exposed fossil fuel market in the world. So all of our pensions are invested in it. It's very, very tricky for us to make that transition, because by its nature, we're moving out of businesses that we've had long established in the market. So it's not a small decision for a government to actually commit to net zero. Okay. So what we did was, from a government point of view, during the period I was responsible for the net zero, we actually developed an overall strategy for net zero, which is a kind of top-down plan that shows across the economy how could you achieve a Paris alignment. Really going to dance all over the place. Here we go. But below that, we also had 8 or more sectoral plans. So a plan for the power sector, a plan for the transport sector, a plan for heat and buildings, a plan for industry, a plan for hydrogen, a plan for CCS, a plan for incorporating in tree planting, etc., and even, you know, through to things like the UK innovation strategy. So ultimately, this is the overall plan that would allow you to deliver net zero between that halving by 2030, zero by 2050. And so if you look at that, there are a few challenges which I wanted to highlight, 4 primarily. There are many challenges, but I'm going to highlight 4. One is how you get there in terms of what the plan implies. The second is how you have to think about it. And this will very much play back to Henry's discussion around the food sector. It's a systemic type of thinking. The third is the nature of the implementation you need. And the fourth is the implications for things like industrial strategy. So on the case of the plan, this is the plan that was laid out in the net zero strategy for the UK. It goes, as I say, very rapidly down just below zero by 2050. It's laid out in the carbon budgets. We have now legislated right the way out to 2037 along that plan. So each 5-year period, we have to hit a set of targets all the way along. So it's not just an overall 2050 target, it's targets right out to 2037. If you look at the plans that sit below that, the power sector goes much faster. So on the same indexation, the power sector is going to go towards zero much faster. And in fact, the UK government committed to a carbon-free power system by 2035. So that, in that sense, power is leading the way in terms of renewables, etc. But if you look at all the other sectors, then you'll see that all of those other sectors follow basically the same plan. So this isn't power goes first, then we do buildings, then we do agriculture. It's power goes a bit ahead, and then everybody else comes behind at the same very fast rate. So that means you need action in industry, you need action in transport, you need action in buildings, all of those in agriculture, all of those need to be at the same rate. The second thing is that you've got to think about it as a system. If you think about the energy system, it's a whole set of supply on the left and the whole set of usage on the right. We've got 20% electricity, 40% gas, 40% oil and petroleum. But if you break it down, within that, the energy system actually has a whole load of very interrelated decisions within that. So you've got a whole set of decisions within electricity. Do you use renewables? Do you use nuclear? Do you use backup capacity? And you have the same kind of decisions within the gas system and within the oil and petroleum system. And you have the same interrelationship between decisions within all of the consuming sectors. So within industry, within transport, you know, if you're doing transport, do you go electric, do you go hydrogen, etc. So you have very complex decision-making within each of the silos. And then you have a whole set of interconnections between those decisions. And we like to call this like a spaghetti bowl of slides. It just reflects in, I think Henry talked about this as a systems basis, these are the policy decisions which are interrelated that government has to make. So it's not possible for one department, for BEIS, or as it was at the time, or DEFRA or others, to make their decisions in isolation. They have to make them as an integrated whole. And so one example of that would be for the gas system, 40% of our energy today. What are we going to do with that? The gas system goes into the power system. So even if we decide to move to the power, we have to think about what does our backup capacity. It obviously goes into buildings at the moment. 85% of buildings in the UK are on the gas system. Do we convert those to electricity, or do we go to hydrogen? If we have lots of hydrogen, then should we use that in transport, in buses or in trains or in heavy goods vehicles? And if we're using it in there, should we convert industry over to carbon capture or to hydrogen? So just the one decision on gas, on hydrogen, has interactions with the whole of the system. So that we have to have a systemic thinking. And then we have to talk about Hull. So Hull, on the Humber, nice location, has a slightly different mix of emissions from us. It's much more industrial, so about 50% of the emissions from Hull are industry and commercial, about 30% housing, about 17% transport, so slightly different from the UK average. The housing is about equal to the UK average, but the new housing is slightly lower energy efficiency and slightly higher on gas usage than the average. So we're building ourselves a future which is slightly in the wrong direction. Our transport system, we're still on diesel. We have 2 bus companies, 2 train companies. We have a whole load of cycling and walking initiatives, but they're not integrated and they're not electrified yet. And then on industry and commercial, we've got carbon capture occurring in Hull as part of the Humber cluster, but we have to look at all the new industries and the turnover of industries converting from old industries to new industries. So we need a plan for Hull that integrates all of the things I've talked about for Hull. And when we've done that, we only have to do another 407 and we've covered the UK. So you can see that this is a level of complexity that you need where you can't just have a strategy of 1,500 odd pages and all the sectoral plans. You actually need a plan for Hull on all the other locations. And then finally, you have to think about your industrial strategy. So the UK has aggressive plans on gigawatt factories for batteries. If you can see the chart, we are about the 4th, very, very slim line from the top. We're going to be about 0.8% of global capacity in 2025. China currently dominates the thing, which might obviously be reflected in the Inflation Reduction Act. But that global scale drives the performance of companies in batteries and solar and wind, etc. And we are not going to be on that chart currently. In hydrogen, however, we have the opportunity to have very low cost blue hydrogen from very soon, because we can capture the emissions and we can use steam methane reformers to provide relatively low cost blue hydrogen. And eventually we can convert that to green hydrogen. So that is an opportunity where we have differential, because we have lots of carbon capture capability, we have differential positioning in hydrogen. Question, do we have the same differential position in batteries? So we have trade-offs and decisions, and each country has those decisions to make. So it's a very complex transition, but from an industrial point of view, from an investor point of view, many of the old rules still apply. So if we take the first industrial revolution, we went from agriculture to industry, and to do that, we had to invest. We doubled our investment rate during the 100 years of the industrial revolution. And as a result, we doubled our growth in our GDP and we doubled our factor productivity. So there is a payoff from investing, but it requires an upfront investment in terms of the transition. And you can see that the transitions are following a lot of the old economics, so cost curves. We saw wind and solar and everything come down those cost curves. Batteries are coming down the cost curves, which means electric vehicles, which are based a lot on the battery costs, are becoming cheaper, which means the penetration will go up. So this is a transition that will happen as we deploy more, the costs will come down, the penetration and the acceptability will go up. In the UK, we are talking about transitioning by 2035. We did 34% battery electric vehicles in December. So we're already transitioning very fast. And if you look at what's happened in the previous transition, this is the transition from horse-drawn carriages, which in 1900 dominated the Easter Parade in New York. 13 years later, was only cars. And that's about the right frequency or speed of a transition. 13 to 15 years is about what we're assuming for many of these transitions. So they happen very, very fast for the infrastructure and for the industries that are involved. And what that means is that when you look at companies that have gone through those transitions, something like Kodak, where you think in 1995, Kodak's profit pool was 1.9 billion, a decent profit pool, mainly in manufacturing and photo finishing. 10 years on, that had shrunk. The whole profit pool had grown to double to 3.7 billion, but the share that was physical photography had shrunk immensely. And obviously we know the future for Kodak was to go bankrupt. And it was these kind of moments that many industries are now facing in this transition. They have their own Kodak moments. So what we're seeing, this where it became very personal for me, was in the electricity sector. In 2009, we had about $500 billion of market cap. In 6 years, we managed to wipe out half of that value by deploying 30% new renewable capacity onto the electricity system in a system that was already balanced. So we didn't need the new capacity, but by putting all that renewable capacity on, we lost a lot of value in the existing shareholders. Now they restructured and have recovered, but out of that turbulence has appeared companies like Ørsted, the old Dong Energy, which has become a very major driver of the offshore wind market. And you're seeing the same thing happening in automotive slightly further back. 2014, 730 billion, dropped to 620 before COVID, this is. And then we had seen a massive emergence of a new player in that industry, equal to the top 10 companies. Now, arguably, whenever I presented this slide, people would say, well, that looks odd, because it looks like the doubling of the automotive industry, and so questioned the valuations, and indeed, the valuations have dropped back. But you still see the same major player has emerged in this industry. If you add that player plus BYD, you have about 43% of the sector is still in the top 10 in the new vehicles, companies which didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. So what we're seeing is this massive turbulence for the incumbents, and we're seeing insurgent players coming through, and we're seeing that happening in lots of sectors. We last saw that in the digital revolution, where you saw companies like Amazon, Meta, Uber, take on Netflix, take on the blockbusters of this world. So you see some businesses coming through, new insurgent businesses appearing, and the incumbents having to adapt to the new realities. And we're seeing that across all of the economies. I've talked about Ørsted and Tesla, but you can go across all of those sectors with those emissions, and you would find new businesses appearing in each of those sectors. Those are the new companies that are attacking, for instance, beyond meat with meat substitutes, which very much Henry talked about. But you're also seeing a lot of incumbent businesses reacting and changing their business models. So you're seeing a very turbulent sector over the next few years as the transition happens. And you're seeing a lot of new businesses emerging in markets which previously didn't have. So these are just the Chinese competitors in each of those sectors, really competing for the market leadership in those. So as I mentioned, BYD is a very, very strong supplier of batteries and electric vehicles. So overall, the kind of message we're talking to a lot of clients about in this business is to understand what's happening to your existing business. How is this transition affecting it? What are the new opportunities coming out of it for new opportunities? So if you're a mining company, how does it affect your thermal coal business versus your copper business, et cetera, et cetera. The third one is how do you manage the transition across this transition. The fourth is how do you think about organizing to deliver that? Because this was a big issue across government, was how do we organize this cross-economy transition? Not one department can deliver this. And then finally, zero means everybody has to be zero, including everybody in this room.
Yeah, good. Great, thank you very much. Very information rich there. Tom, maybe over to you. You've been on the net zero front line for a while. What are you observing?
Right, let's see if we can get this to work first. Oh, bingo. Yeah, okay, so look, I'm firstly going to bring a perspective from our work around the world, not just from the UK. I would just point out one other thing. A lot of people talk about net zero for countries, yeah, within a geographic boundary for cities, city-states, whatever it might be. The vast majority of businesses of any scale nowadays look at their net zero through the value chain. So it actually goes across borders all over the place. So it's orthogonal accounting. And beware when you hear, oh yes, we've got to do what the local government tells us they're doing, because actually that sometimes doesn't make sense. And it's not pitched at the UK, it's just pitched at almost anywhere. So we've done work with net zero for organizations, financial institutions, sometimes governments, but largely businesses in China, Southeast Asia, across Africa, a few great examples of net zero, Latin America, and obviously the US and Northern Europe. So I'm just going to bring a few of these, very few slides, and just really comment on a few things as I see them. Firstly, 4 really significant risks. Let's not kid ourselves, we're not on track to deliver net zero. Nobody is. Okay, so we are on track to fail, which is not great. And we have to recognize why we're failing and what some of the hurdles might be, because we can overcome them if we understand them. So I'm just going to give a few examples. And here are my 4 net zero delivery risks and why we shouldn't and cannot declare victory at this point. The first is that the pace of change that we need to see, and Julian made a very good point on this, is well beyond market norms. We need capital flows to cycle much quicker than would have been the case in the past, much quicker technology development, and much quicker market adoption. Those are all things that have their natural cycles. In the energy sector, arguably, it's 3 decades for energy technology to go from inception to maturity. Market adoption, it can be very quick or it can be very slow. So you've got to play around with these things, but overall, the pace of change and the scale is outside any of the norms that our systems and institutions are coping with. Second is there's a real problem with lock-in. So if you've got a productive asset, it's fully depreciated, it's still giving you a solid economic rent, why change it? So there is enormous lock-in. It's lock-in of assets, infrastructure, behaviors, lock-in all across the piece. So I would argue a combination of lock-in and vested interests support, sadly, a very credible alternative where the status quo prevails and we never achieve net zero. There are an awful lot of people out there looking at us in this room thinking, you are smoking something. Really, net zero is never going to happen, not in my lifetime. So, third point, decarbonisation, it needs a lot of technology, a lot of innovation. Now, the good news is a lot of the innovation can be digital, it can be much quicker, it can be much easier to roll out, and it's, as you've shown, some really great examples of breakthrough technologies. Having said that, an awful lot of what needs to become net zero is infrastructure, not necessarily known for its innovation. And at the end of the day, a lot of the innovation is in areas where there is no natural owner. I remember when offshore wind started, the obvious thing was the oil and gas sector, used to massive investment against a certain risk profile and a good return. And all of a sudden you come along with something called offshore wind. Well, that wasn't so good because the power sector is rated lower than oil and gas. So nobody in the oil and gas sector wanted to be in power. You look at the power companies and they were typically very, very slim balance sheet, very limited investment in innovation, just didn't have the understanding of big technology transformation. And it was this nasty standoff. As it was, the developers have actually made a great job of this. Offshore wind is now a great success. And lastly, it's this horrendous point that accelerated change needs everybody to agree on a whole number of things. Governments to set standards and norms, financial institutions to back. And at the end of the day, we need businesses to move forward in some form of alignment. Again, Julian was making a good point about how aligned these things need to be. One of the issues we have is democratic stiction. I looked it up in a dictionary. It's the force that prevents that first bit of momentum. And believe me, democracies are good at blocking progress. If we were in China, we'd look at this differently. We're not in China. We're in democracies by the large. And democratic stiction is making this really hard work. So if all of this sounds really horrendous and doomsday scenario, it needn't be. A couple of things have just come across to us, and the first and most obvious is that real climate action happens when we're able to make business sense of climate change. When you can make the business case in the context of governments, financial constraints, behaviours, and so on, you win. If you try and go against that, and you cannot make a case that really makes sense, on the whole, it fails. That's just looking at it over a few years. So those are the bad news stories. What can we do about it? Firstly, be pragmatic. And this is where I think it's terrific to see such great examples of people saying, look, we may not have the end result, but we can at least make some good positive steps forward. And so long as they don't lock in, worth doing. So the first thing I'd say, and this is focused really at development banks, governments, and others who have access to public funding, is to focus that public funding on policy that is compatible with net zero and investment that avoids lock-in. It is astonishing how many governments at the moment are putting their public funding into technologies that will be locking us in and make net zero more difficult, not easier. Okay, we voted for. Second, translate a net zero narrative that everybody seems to have today into some credible bottom-up pathways with some real staged success points. Again, it was too easy 2-3 years ago to say, yeah, we're going to go net zero. Well, 2050, yeah, we'll do that. In fact, we'll do better. We'll do it 2040. And you end up with this ridiculous race to how fast you can make a claim to net zero. The reality is net zero is hard. And the next thing everybody can do is to say, whatever your claim is, wherever you are on this, do it bottom up and check whether it works. And in the vast majority of cases, that implies, firstly, optimizing your current business model, but at the same time, investing in options to make a much more fundamental transformation of your business as and when regulations, investment, technology, market adoption make that possible. So you've got to simultaneously manage for the relatively short and medium term and manage for the longer term. Very hard when almost no businesses have business plan horizon beyond 5 years. They have some scenario planning, but not business planning. And investors look often well within the 5-year horizon. I sit on the board of a PLC. It's a nightmare. Lastly, coming down here, this is the big thing of the moment. The last 2 years, since everybody's declared net zero, people have started saying, hang on a minute, that's not real. And all kinds of language has come into this. Sincerity. Now, sincerity isn't finance speak, it's not technical speak, it's not policy speak. We all know what it means. And I think it was actually Total who came out with a net zero plan, and it was widely acclaimed by the city. People said, look, this is really progressive. It's well up with the best we've seen elsewhere. And that's terrific. And 2 days later, a couple of analysts came out and said, no, this isn't sincere. And they basically pointed at the relative proportion of investment going into the status quo versus the transformation. And they said this therefore isn't sincere. That's an extreme example. The number of cases now where organizations in pretty much every market, from food to apparel to air travel, other travel, mobility, are having to defend their net zero claims. It's just everywhere. And at the end of the day, that's got to be the last thing. If you can't do anything else, just be really transparent, really clear, explain what you've assumed, why you've assumed it, and don't hide anything. Because interestingly, in the world of sustainability, commercial confidentiality has no place. It's not accepted. People will say, no, hang on a minute. We want to know what the facts actually are. We want to know what you're doing. So challenge net zero to be sincere. 4 pragmatic actions. You can go on and list many more, but that would be a pretty good start for anybody. So I'm going to focus on the last point here, transparency and disclosure to avoid greenwash, because it is everywhere. Financial institutions, corporates, governments, everybody is facing this challenge of, can they really prove that they are credible? And when we started looking at this, and we started saying, well, what are the problems? The first is that net zero is ill-defined. I highlighted the fact you can have net zero on a geographic basis, you can have it on a value chain, but it goes far beyond that. So people, in describing their net zero pathways, their routes to net zero, typically have three flaws that you can look out for. The first is that they base their pathways on implausible assumptions, often where the implausibility is outside their control. They assume their market will go a certain direction. They assume that a technology will work, and therefore it's going to be okay. Much better to have assumptions that are within your own control than ones that are outside. So the majority of companies where you're going to pick a hole in the net zero plan is because the assumptions are implausible. The second, and there simply isn't a solution to this, in aggregate, if you take all of the net zero claims together, you should add up the whole lot and end up with net zero. That's what you should get. Add up across geographies, add up across sectors, you should end up with net zero, however you choose to account for it. The reality is an awful lot of people put into their plans, their routes to net zero, a demand on scarce resources. It can be land, it can be water, it can be minerals, which when added up with everybody else's net zero pathways, mean that we blow planetary boundaries very quickly. Some sectors have such a focus on nature-based solutions, and by the way, I love nature-based solutions, that if you add up all their net zero pathways, you need several planets to just meet that need. So that's the second big problem. And the third is probably even worse. It's the people who actually don't intend to get to net zero at all. They simply think, what can I do to keep everybody off my back for the next 5, 10 years? And what I'll do is I'll do the optimizing of my current business. I'll say the right things. I'll put something into the development of a future option, which may or may not come good. And basically, I have no intention of taking my organization to net zero, but I am buying time. So 3 quite fundamental challenges. And then we said internally, and this is something that we haven't shared externally as the Carbon Trust, we do look at the people we work with. We want to test them for their sincerity, their credibility. We want to work with people for whom we can have an impact by helping them be more ambitious and succeed. So we have a sort of screening, and we wanted our screening to incorporate some of these flaws. And this is where we've sort of come out. And this is something that we've started developing largely for internal use, and we're still trying to work out how to use it externally. We call it the Net Zero Reality Check. And what's interesting here is that you can do this for any organization that you work with, you're a customer of, you vote for. You can do it for anybody by applying to these simple questions your judgment about the assumptions you want to make. So if you're somebody who believes in nuclear everywhere, fine, you just assume nuclear everywhere. If you don't believe there should be any nuclear, take it out. Use your assumptions and judgment to assess whether you believe whoever you're looking at is credible and sincere. Now, at the end of the day, it's credibility and urgency seem to be the 2 things we're looking at. So down at the bottom there, have you got a coherent net zero plan? Does it all add up? That's pretty fundamental. Use of natural resources, come back to these scarce resources. Are you making a plan that's so dependent on something that you know is likely to be scarce, it can't be insured? Thirdly, offsets. An awful lot of net zero plans have an awful lot of carbon offsets from the carbon markets. Are they high integrity carbon offsets? And are you planning, because nobody's got a net zero plan that is quick enough to get to the end point without having real greenhouse gas removal, which is the hard bit, actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So are the offsets good? And lastly, verification. Are you up? Are you transparent? Are you having this independently verified by anybody you want? So that's the credibility. That's the base case. You've really got to be there, or you should be asking the next question, which is there urgency in the organization? And we just use 3 very simple questions. And that's the things that we've just seen time and time again reflected in urgency. 1, motive. Are incentives actually aligned with the Paris Agreement? At the moment, investors in London Stock Exchange are pushing very hard for all long-term bonuses, long-term schemes to have at least 20% tied to sustainability objectives. And that's a good thing. So look for that. Recognition and ownership. Is climate impact actually acknowledged and owned by the organization? In some cases, it really isn't. My former employer, Shell, this week has gone back to its investors to say, yeah, that scope 3 stuff, not our problem. We're going to stick to our operations. I thought that was a debate we had 5-10 years ago. And yet this week, Shell are going back to explain why they're doing less on net zero, because it's not their responsibility. Explain that to the rest of the world. Intent, lastly, are sufficient people and investment allocated to net zero? Are budgets there? Are the people there? Is the commitment there? Anyway, 7 questions. Take it away, have some fun with it. We ran this through about 30 different examples just to see if it kind of worked. And there were 2 fundamental biases that we came up with. The first actually was a bias against the oil and gas sector. Everybody assumed it was bad. And the second was a bias in favor of the public sector. People really didn't want to question governments and public institutions and development banks. They thought that intrinsically they would always be right and sincere. Make up your own minds. That's it. Great points.
Great, so we're going to turn it over to the audience, but before we do that, so get your questions ready. I'd just like to ask one question to each of the panelists. So maybe just turning a bit more internationally. Julian, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act that Biden has just put in place in the US. Is that the silver bullet?
Well, it's certainly a bullet. It is obviously having a dramatic impact on investment decisions globally. If you were thinking, and previously a lot of the debate was around Europe, and Europe had a much more developed framework, and that made justified the investments in solar and in wind, not always in the right places, but certainly the overall regulatory framework was much more stable. During starting my time in the civil service, I spent quite a lot of time on the Hill, and it was certainly less stable and not very positive in the previous administration around this. So the US has transitioned immensely, and the motivation behind the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is twofold. One is, it does have a positive effect on the climate objectives for the US and for the globe. But 2, and much more important, is obviously China, which a lot of the technologies which I mentioned, solar panels, batteries, cars, and the number of Chinese competitors that are growing out of those cost curves by scaling very rapidly on the domestic market and then exporting is obviously causing the North American administrations to have kittens about that. And so the Inflation Reduction Act is both a good thing in itself, but is also a kind of a restatement of their industrial strategy plans, quite consistent with the plans I described for the UK. Downside is obviously it creates a lot of protectionism.
Yeah, very. Julian, you mentioned China, and Tom, I'd like to pick up with you on that one, because China's a bit of a conundrum, because it's still the biggest carbon emitter in the world, yet they have very large pipeline of renewable energy projects, and look at the EVs and so on. So what's your thoughts?
I mean, China is so big. It has created domestic markets for renewable power, for EVs, that are self-sustaining in their own. So whereas the UK has to work internationally for it to get the scale to see some of the technologies we want to develop carried forward and achieve economic scale, China can achieve economic scale in virtually every part of this equation through its own domestic market. It can then drive that domestic market through some pretty strong legislation. I remember years ago where literally whole cities would just be forced onto EVs to support the development of the supply chain. And so, yes, China has an extraordinary appetite for green investment, whilst at the same time, an enormous, insatiable demand for energy and an appetite for coal and, dare I say, Russian oil and gas. So, yeah, China's a real awkward one. The real interesting thing also is the Inflation Reduction Act is invariably stimulating now a response from the EU, and it'll be from others. I mean, the scale of the investment is very significant. But just to put it roughly in context, I think my numbers are about right. Aramco, Saudi Arabia's national oil company, its profits announced last year, $161 billion for 1 year, is about half the Inflation Reduction Act over multiple years. So, yeah, there's lots of money out there.
Wow. So we're already seeing a lot of questions from the audience. So let's go to the audience. So Paolo, I think you had your first hand up.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So no doubt we have to accelerate the transition, no? And we have three actors: the public sector, the business, and the individuals. Who among the three will lead the acceleration?
You go first. If you ask the Committee on Climate Change, would say 62% of the actions require a change in behaviour of the individual. But that's, I think, looking at it on a very all-inclusive fashion. So if you look at the power sector and transport, around half of the emissions in a developed market, it is already cheaper to do renewables globally than in about 2/3 of markets, and will be cheaper in 80–90% of the markets very quickly because the costs keep on coming down. I mean, if you're putting up solar in the Middle East, you can put it up at $15, maybe $10, $12 in Morocco. So you're looking at per megawatt hour. So you're looking at really very, very below the cost of putting up a factory, a plant to burn a fossil fuel, even if it's free. So that will transition. EVs are doing exactly the same thing on the curves, and you're seeing a willingness for consumers to say, well, actually, I quite like this product. It's better, it's cheaper, it's more efficient, and it doesn't create all the emissions that create asthma cases in quite the same way. It has its own challenges. So I think you can get consumers across the board quite easily on at least half the emissions. The rest is, a lot of it's industrial, which is obviously about getting corporates to lead on those products. And then ultimately you get down to the tricky sectors of agriculture and aviation and travel. So I think the momentum though can be built up, but you do have to have a consistency. You can't be importing in the way that Henry described food from other markets and embedding carbon in that food, or bringing in steel to make cars and embedding carbon in the steel. So that's going to result in a lot of tariff discussions around carbon border adjustments and proper level playing fields. But I think business, the economics in many cases are beyond the tipping points, and business can have a very strong role in driving this with the support of government in catalysing things.
I'll just make one point. Totally agree with that. I think there's a hidden hand that could still be really powerful in this agenda. It's the individual not acting as a consumer, not acting as a voter, but acting as a saver. Capital flows are dominated in scale by savings. If we all started seriously wanting our savings to be put to different purpose, that is an enormous driver of change. And it would make businesses and governments far more comfortable if it was clear people really cared about it as a consumer, as a voter, but also in terms of their saving habits. That really would just anchor it, I think.
That's a terrific point, Tom. We're going to take a question from our hybrid audience, our virtual audience. This one's out of South Africa, and it's for you, Julian, and it is, how mature are these technologies in the UK that are greening the way we do many things, and are they able to be exported to emerging markets? Are we close enough for that are full dependent?
So I would agree with Tom that there are a lot of technological innovations still to come in the next 30 years. I mean, I continue to think 2050 is when I started in the power sector, just post privatization in the UK, and you kind of forget how much things have changed in 30 years and how much they will change in the next 30 years. But in terms of the technologies, the core technologies that you need, we can put together a plan for net zero in the UK, which does not assume the magic wand of a technology that will come along. We do assume that technology will continue to bring costs down and pull forward things in the way that it allowed us to go from an 80% target to a 100% reduction by 2050 in the change in the legislation to net zero. So we didn't have to put in additional cost assumptions to do that. The technology had brought it forward. And I think, so I would say, a lot of the debate in COP26 was around South Africa. It was a very prominent part of the transition plan that we developed with South Africa. And that was much about dealing with some of the issues that Tom dealt with, which is the just transition. And it wasn't that the technology was an issue. There's plenty of renewables that can be used in South Africa, and there's plenty of coal. and gas in Mozambique, etc. So you got a real just transition issue that you've got people employed in sectors which will inherently have their Kodak moments, and a whole set of technologies which are going to come through. And it's how you help the sectors transition.
Yeah, of course, the just transition, energy equity is, of course, another topic on that. Yes, there was a hand raised there.
Yeah. You mentioned, Julian, the carbon sequestration or capture, and you said that the UK is particularly well equipped for that. Wondering what's that specifically in the UK, but more generally, how much of a part of a solution can that be? The oil and gas industry is sort of betting on that a lot to be able to justify some of its existing business models.
The UK was very insightful. What we did was we took our gas out of our field so that we could put CO2 back into it, which, without being facetious about it, we do have a lot of empty gas fields, which allows us to look at about 100 years of geological storage capacity for a country, if looking at our production of CO2. Obviously, if you go back to Don's point, if you calculate the amount of CCS that you would require to sequestrate all of the emissions from all the fossil fuels, then we would need a few more planets worth of stores. So we can't do that, but there's no necessity to do that, in the sense that we have perfectly good solutions for the renewable electricity generation. We have perfectly good solutions for vehicles. That's half already. So why would we capture those when we could actually get rid of them at source? Energy efficiency. Why use the energy in the first place? Why not just not need it? So when you get to the points where the really difficult emissions, then you will need solutions like carbon capture, and you will need direct air capture, and you'll need reforestation. But you can't build enough forests for everybody. You can't build enough CCS to capture everything.
Question over there.
Yeah, hi. Two questions, one about PPPs and one about stranded assets. About PPPs, you talked about democratic extinction and China not having the benefit or burden of having to deal with that as much. They could just basically push through things like solar panel and cost curves. Do you see any models or an evolution of PPPs that will, in our kind of part of the world, that will kind of be able to take on and push through these technological advancements? And then the second question about stranded assets is, when does the long-term cost become so high that we just have to think about stranded assets as a real option?
By PPPs, I presume you mean
public-private partnerships, yes.
Yeah, I think public-private partnerships work so long as everybody's a willing party. And, I think the point I made earlier, when people stand up and vote and consume and save in a manner that is consistent, then everybody else will just fall in behind that. So I do believe that could happen. It may not, but let's be optimistic. That could happen. And your second point was around stranded assets. Yeah, look, depending on your set of assumptions, you can conclude we have a whole bunch of stranded assets today, and that we're investing in even more stranded assets. You could also take a different assumption, take a different pathway to net zero, and be more dependent on certain other technologies and things coming through, and say, no, actually, everything that we're doing okay is fine. Take the IEA's view, they don't believe it's fine, particularly in terms of the high carbon intensive fossil fuels and so on. But yeah, it depends on the assumptions you want to put around what stranded assets mean.
I guess, what are the right assumptions given the fact that we have crisis?
If you start from the assumption that we do genuinely need to get to net zero, that starts to limit things quite significantly.
But what you can guarantee is there's a lot of risk in. So one of those answers is right. It's like all marketing budgets. 50% is right. So you never know which 50%. But as an investor, you better be clearer that you have a view on this, because you could be the wrong side of that.
Yeah.
We have a question from our virtual audience regarding the possibility of a moonshot that removes carbon from the air. And depending on its likelihood, how should we think about allocating resources between the drive for net zero and the drive for the moonshot?
Let's take that.
A lot of people say, well, how do you manage the relatively certain short term with very uncertain future? The only industry I can think of where this is done on a regular basis is pharmaceuticals, the development of drugs that are unknown. And certainly in the past the Carbon Trust, we've done work with governments, essentially adopting the same logic that pharmaceutical industries use to allocate between today's net zero target and a moonshot solution where actually you can get through the thing by technology alone. There isn't a simple answer.
I would say if I had a choice between gambling on red 14 or putting it on red or black, I would go for I'd go for the more certain outcome. I think risking everything on the basis of a moonshot is a risky strategy, and it's unnecessarily risky because we've already got lower cost energy sources, we've got lower cost vehicles. Why would you not deploy those anyway? The moonshot can take account of the last 10 or 15% if it succeeds. We don't need it to solve a lot of them.
It's like nuclear fusion, it's always 10 years away, isn't it?
So we're a funder of INSEAD alumni, and we've got an INSEAD alumnus right here in the UK, which has developed carbon capture technique to pull carbon currently out of exhaust gas where it's at high concentrations. And the big challenge they have, we're talking about the technology. Technology is often there, but there's a big gap between, they have a lineup of industries who want to buy 2, 3, 4, 5 from their units, but nobody wants to be number one. And I don't know if you've thought about how to bridge this gap between science is funded and then fully proven commercial things are funded. You can count on private sector people, like some Canadian comes along and funds your UK carbon capture technology, but how do you see that gap being bridged? And if you thought of that, because I think the technology is actually there, it's just a question of helping it get over the hump to be used.
I mean, the technology may well be there, and it may well be one of a number of options. A lot of people are looking at this at the moment because it's becoming apparent that we're really going to need this. Towards the end, hopefully, of a net zero pathway. And I think the two things. One, advanced procurement. People are starting to say, okay, for people who really need it, and they need to build it into their net zero plans, maybe there's some way of anticipating demand, precipitating that. Or you can be Microsoft. Microsoft net zero pathway is textbook in every possible way. And at the end of the day, they just said, look, there's a whole bunch of technology here we're going to need. We don't have the answer, nor does anybody else. I think they put $1 billion on the table. Just say, get going with that. So credit to them. They can afford it. They did that.
And I think the government role in this, back to the previous question, is in many cases it's catalytic. It has to choose. So on wind, we have wind, as you note outside. We don't have sun, as you will note outside. And so putting money into wind was a very logical thing for the UK to do. In fact, if anything, we went hot on it, then we went slightly cold on it, and we went hot again on it. It would have been better to be consistent, and that consistency towards the end of the period had a huge effect on the cost of capital, on the ability for people to scale their plants, etc. But we didn't need to, as a government, be permanently involved in wind. We had to provide the contract for difference to incentivize it when it was at £115. 4 years later, it was £39.65. That's below the wholesale price. So it keeps on coming down as well, which is the nice thing about cost curves. So the catalytic role is up front, but we can't catalyze every technology in every country. So the UK has to pick its shots as to where it's going to play.
Any more? Yep.
Just a quick question, and I admit not an easy one. Personally, do you think we're solving the right challenge by focusing on climate first and then thinking that nature is going to be a fast follower, but yet a follower? Because a lot of the technologies that we talked about, they are commercially viable and they offer a solution to the climate crisis, but they have negative externalities on nature. And therefore, are they going to allow us to live within the planetary boundaries that are a fundamental assumption of a credible transition?
Repeat the question for those virtual.
Yeah, so the question, if I paraphrase you, is are we focusing on the right things? Because some of the technologies you're saying basically will have negative externalities. Is that right?
On nature. That is absolutely the right question to ask. There is now an enormous focus on nature and biodiversity. I think the simple answer is we need to ensure those negative impacts are modest, if none. And we need to look after nature, water. Water stress is absolutely huge as a problem. At the same time, some people talk about just transition as if it's sort of something that's grasped out of thin air. you've got to say, do you really believe we could have the transition Julian was describing without it being just? You've got to look after people. You've got to look after nature and all the other aspects. Nobody, no democracy would drive through something that would absolutely trash nature and our environment. That's my personal view. So I think there's a degree of self-control on that. But let's not kid ourselves. We've got to get the climate bit right because it has impacts on people that are just horrific.
I would answer on the, I got asked a lot. I was responsible for carbon, and I said that's easy because I can count carbon molecules, and I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to have a plan to get rid of them, and we're going to work on that. There was a lot of debate as to whether you should also then include biodiversity, same objectives. I was saying not having a plan for biodiversity and not having a plan for carbon is worse than having a plan for one of those. So let's have a plan for one of them, preferably that helps the other. And certainly, as soon as you have it, you want to refine that plan to ensure that it does what you want to do on biodiversity, which I think is the correct. And the problem is that if you keep on adding things onto the camel, eventually the straw will break its back and you won't get it done. So I think having a rather, a narrow vision on carbon was probably the right thing at the right time. But we do now have a plan for net zero with all the sectoral plans. Now we need to iterate and refine those and make sure that they are the best for biodiversity as well. In a way, a lot of what Henry talks about as well, just thinking about them in conjunction.
Katie, any questions
Yeah,
online?
we had a question related to EU resource allocation. And that was at a time when, can you hear me? At a time when the EU is trying to both reduce the price of renewables, but also invest in the sources of green energy that allow the sale of renewable energy. How should they think about resource allocation? Because they've got those two problems happening at once.
Not to do it the way they did in version 1.0. I mean, the European investment in renewables back in the 2010s and early part of that decade was based on national investment considerations. Germany invested a lot in solar. Germany doesn't have much more sun than the UK. Spain built a lot of windmills, doesn't have a lot of the wind. The wind is in the north of Europe and the sun is in the south of Europe. And the more you integrate your grid and the more you think about things on a lowest cost solution, we could have saved about a third of our investment during that period by just putting the solar panels further south and the wind farms further north. So I think the integrating systems, this is from somebody who had to sit through Brexit, integrating the electricity grids, I think is and having level playing fields and allowing the markets, now the markets, certainly in this sector, know what technologies to deploy. You don't need to be spending a lot of time in perverting the markets to get perverse regions.
Okay, any further questions? Yeah.
A question maybe on the right definition of net zero and what it means in terms of setting the objectives by country or by industry. Because net zero, if I understand well, is getting to a point where you abate enough CO2 emissions that there's a balance between what you emit and what the country can, what the earth can absorb, right? Which means that you still have a quota of CO2 which you can, or CO2 equivalents you can emit in the environment because the earth is going to absorb it. How do you then define the different goals or objectives by country or by industries? Because in the end, that means that some of these rights, these emission rights, should be allocated.
So I know Julian will answer the second bit better than I can. Firstly, carbon neutral this is the emission associated with this vehicle, this transport. I want to make it carbon neutral today, so I'll buy an offset. I've got to believe the offset is of high integrity. One balances the other, that's carbon neutrality. Nothing to do with net zero. Net zero is you take whatever it is, the factory, whatever it might be, and you bring it down and down and down and down through transformation and change to the point where what is left is the absolute minimum carbon emissions associated with that factory, that process, that product, and so on. At that point, what is left, you have to actually take out of the atmosphere as greenhouse gas removal. Okay, so there's no offset in the conventional sense. You actually reduce your carbon emissions to a very low amount, and then you actually take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to achieve net zero. Net zero is exactly what it says. The challenge is technologies for the back end are not that well proven. And to your point, there is no easy accounting that says, well, do we do it by sector with everybody taking the same burden? That doesn't make sense in some ways. We actually want more renewable power. So renewable power is going to grow in terms of its emissions, and yet we want it to go down to zero. I mean, there are some really challenging things of trying to make everything fair to everybody, because some people have greater potential to reduce their carbon emissions and contribute to other people's reduction. And that's where it all gets very messy in the accounting.
I would say kind of one side adjacent point, which is zero is a really nice number. When we used to have the target of 80% reduction, that left 20%. And it was like talking to people about their driving and saying, well, which percentage of drivers are you in? And 90% of people say they're in the top 20% of drivers, which obviously doesn't work. And when you sat around a cabinet table, you'd say, we've got to get rid of 80% of our emissions. And everybody would go, that's absolutely fine. I'm in the 20% that doesn't need to do that. Well, when you get to zero, you look around the table and say, well, which of you doesn't understand zero? And they go, well, I'm finding it really hard for me to get to zero. Well, yeah, you're finding it really hard, but everybody else can't get to less than zero. So you still have to get to zero, largely. I mean, there's a simplification. It's a really powerful number. Zero is zero. Everybody in this room has to be net zero for us to be net zero. If some of you are able to eat carbon, then the rest of
Okay, I think we've got to stop it there. We're almost out of time.
Unfortunately, we do. But I mean, just to elaborate a little bit on what Julie said, 59% of carbon today, according to all the top scientists, remains in the air. So there's not really any wiggle room. I mean, we have completely outstripped nature's ability, oceans, forests, peat bogs, to absorb the carbon we emit. So it's very serious, it's urgent, and we thank you for your research, and we're giving you some awesome INSEAD recyclable, renewable swag.
Thank you.
And in closing, I'm going to say something inspirational in a second, but just a couple housekeeping things. We have to scoot right out of here. There's another group coming in about 12 minutes. So we're gonna have to go fast and quietly. I apologize for my border collie imitation, herding you all back into the room at coffee hour or coffee break, but there's a lot of Bain meetings happening on that corridor. So swift and quietly. 7 books were not claimed. Joanna is going to very quickly read the names, and if they're yours, take them. If you don't claim them, we're just giving them away to the first one.
Binesh Lukman.
Hello, has his book.
Dmitry Govorov. For real?
No.
Oh, yeah. You can have it, yeah. First hand up. If the person's not here, first hand up.
Véronique Leroy.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely me.
Stand, okay. You raise your hand if it's not you, but you stand up if it is. So who is the first hand? Over here. Maria O'Shea, she's a founding member of Endeavour, you get it.
Okay. Rahima Valji.
He has one. He already got one. Don't worry, he has his book, just so you know.
What about someone online? The
online people got ebooks, so we're fine. Okay.
Madiha Javai.
Okay, so that one. Let's just go up to Joanne afterwards.
Close to the.
Paul Gooden.
All good?
Yeah.
All right, you guys see Joanna, there'll be 3 books left. Oh, actually give one to Robin, she's reading it. All right, now I just want to close by saying Endeavour got started when Philippe Danger, who's sitting over here, came from the NGO world. And he sent an email out to all the students and faculty and staff, and this is when we had a VAX system. So email meant it went within the building. 1993 and said, anybody else interested in, social and economic impact? And we had 120 responses overnight. And I was the other NGO person in the section. And so the two of us got together and found kindred spirits. Raise your hands if you're in that first group. I know Maria, Kamal, Philippe. Put together this club that started to work really hard to both bring new courses to INSEAD, to bring new organizations that could recruit INSEADers into careers in sustainability, and to create some compass setting events like this one where you had content that informed the way you might want to think about key issues in social economic, and in 5 years in we added environmental development. So now we're at another inflection point. We'll be sending out a survey because we think that, we're not the only club now that cares about this. We would love to do this sort of thing annually if there's demand. And we would also love to do it in the most carbon neutral way. So I'm going to be really interested to hear how the hybrid folks enjoyed today. And we'll do it in a way where there's already a natural grouping as there was in London today because of the Euro Forum that's happening starting tonight. So we'll try to, in all ways, to keep our footprint really low, but please do respond to a survey when we send it out to you. And I just want to thank you all for coming, for your expertise in the room, for our expertise at the front of the room, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
We have our own little drinks for the we're just doing the drinks right now. You're welcome to those. Well, this is from 5 to 6. I want to do yours. Yeah. You want to? Yeah. A year or 2 years ago. And are you one of our clients?
Yes, obviously. There tonight? Yeah, that's why I work on I'm doing an active climate adaptive yeah. I'll be around. So have a, yeah, exactly. You know, it's 90%. It's it. You just put like one linear register of AC in there on it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what we're doing. My data science is like literally 90% of it's finding the beginning of it. And then I just put one line for my, AI I want to use. Yeah, when the COVID started, exactly. Yeah, you got it. We're trying to develop it. Yeah, that's what you were focusing on sustainability.
What the hell? Just carbon capture. I was going to mention.
No, that's fine.
Climate guy. No, we're not the same. But thank you, Seth. I overlooked he looks young. It's not really either one. No, we're in the same club together. I'm not as much involved.
Turn plastic into fuel. When you do a high pressure, you take carbon out of the air.
Good. I'll get back involved.
And the problem is, science is scientific
Everybody will get in their economy.
Yeah, well, in fact, somebody who studied there was at the end of 1995.
Yeah, we did.
This is bias and haven't changed.
Yeah. Okay.